My lady, please may I call Dr. Tamsin Newlove Delgado.
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly,
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming to help us, Doctor.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Tamsin Newlove Delgado.
Dr. Newlove Delgado, you should have in front of you a 69-page report that you prepared that bears the number INQ 000587958. Can you confirm that that's a report that you prepared with Professor Cathy Creswell?
Yes, that's correct.
And can you confirm that any facts that you stated in that report are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, I can confirm.
And can you also confirm that within that statement you've set out any opinions that you have set out represent your true and complete professional opinion on the matters to which they refer?
Yes.
Dr. Delgado, Dr. Newlove Delgado, I think it's right that you are the director of the Children and Young People's Mental Health Research Collaboration Unit at the University of Exeter. Is that right?
Yes.
And you're also an associate professor in children's public mental health medicine as well. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And you're an honorary consultant in public health medicine as well, with the Office for Health Improvement and Disparities. And that you have a research in the public health aspects of the mental health in children with a particular interest in time trends. Is that correct?
Yes.
And does that mean, in essence, that you have a particular interest in how children's mental health as a population changes over time?
Yes, that's correct.
And specific to the pandemic, I think it's right that you were an academic co-lead for the survey consortium that delivered the NHS survey England Mental Health of Children and Young People between 2020 and 2024. Is that also right? And that you were also either the lead researcher or co-lead researcher on specific projects that were examining children's mental health during the pandemic.
Yes.
And in terms of Professor Creswell, I think for our purposes, she was one of the lead researchers on a number of projects as well during the pandemic. Is that correct?
Yes.
Your report refers to a number of different concepts related to children's mental health. And I wanted to start, please, if I could, with well-being, because I think a point you make is that well-being is a very specific concept that should be treated distinctly from children having mental health conditions. Is that right?
Yes.
And when we discuss children's well-being, very broadly, what does that refer to?
Yes, so well-being is it's a broader concept that will refer more holistically to how children and young people are doing, so how they are flourishing, their quality of life, and really their ability to contribute and participate. So it's a much broader concept than when we talk about mental health conditions, which refers more specifically to, I suppose, difficulties or symptoms relating to mental health. So I'm happy to say more about that if...
Yes, I think it was just so that we can establish from the outset, when I moved to asking you about well-being, something very distinct. It is possible, though, isn't it, to measure well-being in children as a population?
Yes, that's right. I mean, measures are never perfect, and obviously at a population level they give us a general overview. But yes, there are certain measures which we use to measure well-being in children and young people that will ask them about things like their satisfaction with different aspects of their lives, how they feel they're contributing to their community, and so on. So yes, there are measures of well-being.
And we'll come back and I will ask you questions about how those measures may have changed. But it's also correct, isn't it, that there are a series of surveys that are carried out in England that are intended to assess the prevalence of possible mental health conditions in children and young people as well.
Yes, that's correct. So we also have in England a series of national child mental health surveys which measure both sort of mental health difficulties more broadly, but also mental health conditions or diagnoses, whichever language you prefer to use. And that in the past, those surveys have also included the whole of Great Britain, but the most recent one was only for England.
So if I can just ask you then, in terms of the regularity of those, I think it's correct that there were surveys carried out on a national basis in 1999, 2004 and 2017 prior to the pandemic. Is that correct?
Yes, so the 1999 and 2004 surveys covered the whole of Great Britain,
Yes.
and the 2017 one just for England.
And then during the pandemic, surveys were carried out in 2020, 2021, 2022 and 2023. Is that correct?
Yes.
And were those surveys carried out at a more frequent interval because of the pandemic?
Yes, absolutely. That was the case. I think particularly once the findings of the first survey in 2020 were known, it became apparent that we would need to monitor children and young people's mental health much more frequently throughout the pandemic.
And may I also just check with you, and I can take you if needs be to a statement that helps us establish this, but you may know. Broadly speaking, is the profile of children's mental health similar in each part of the United Kingdom?
I think on a very broad level, I think it's fair to say it would be similar. There are some differences potentially between the way that risk and protective factors might look like between some of the different nations of the UK. And we also, it's probably fair to say, have more research that has been done into children and young people's mental health within England, Wales and Scotland than in Northern Ireland, simply due to the fact that the national surveys previously included Great Britain and not Northern Ireland.
So taking the position up to 2017, there's a fairly clear picture of what the position was in Wales, Scotland and England, correct?
Sorry, do you mind repeating that question?
I will repeat it. Because the earlier surveys covered the whole of the United Kingdom prior to 2017, that gives a fairly good indication as to consistency in England, Scotland, Scotland and Wales.
Yes, I think on balance it's probably fair to say that it does. But of course, we can also draw from the other surveys such as Understanding Society, which cover the other nations of the UK, including Northern Ireland, and we also have other research from Wales and Scotland. So I think when we take it all together, we can see a fairly consistent picture.
I'm grateful. And I'll come and ask you about some of the work that was done specific to Northern Ireland in any event which you draw attention to. So just going back then, please, to well-being. You pointed out that prior to the pandemic, there was some assessment of children's well-being, and you have that at paragraph 21 of your report if you needed it. But I think in broad terms, 12% of children who had been surveyed between age 10 and 17 had low well-being. Is that correct?
Yes, that's prior to the pandemic with the Understanding Society data.
Thank you. And in terms of the Born in Bradford study as well, to which you refer at paragraph 23, you said out there that fewer than 1 in 10 children said that they were never happy. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in terms of the age of those children, are you able to help us with that?
Yes, so the Born in Bradford study is particularly valuable because although it isn't nationally representative, it's regional. It's a good source of information about primary school children and particularly in a more ethnically diverse area. So that would have covered younger primary school aged children, whereas the other data that I referred to was in older adolescents. So I'm just checking 10 to 17-year-olds.
Yes. So that Born in Bradford study is useful for these smaller, younger children about whom a bit less is known. Is that right?
Yes.
And then just moving on, please, to mental disorder. In terms of the results that emerged from the survey work that was done in 2017, I think you set out that that provided an overall estimated prevalence of 12.8%. Is that correct?
Yes.
And that's a figure of approximately 1 in 9.
Yes.
And can you just explain in terms, and I think it's probably important to make clear, that this survey was estimating probable mental disorder in children. Is that correct?
So just to clarify, and hopefully this won't be too technical, so the 2017 survey used a standardised diagnostic assessment, which means when we refer to those figures from 2017, they actually refer to not probable disorder, but disorder,
Right.
because of the instrument that was used. When we talk about the follow-up surveys, which I think you'll come to talking about when we talk about the impact of the pandemic, there we use probable disorder because we use a slightly different instrument. But it's also the case that that same instrument was used in 2017, which enables us to compare 2017 and 2020 and the follow-up surveys. But that specific figure that I provide there on page 10 is a figure of any disorder rather than probable disorder. And I'm happy to explain more about how that's measured, if useful.
I think for our purposes, what's probably really important is just understanding the extent to which the results in 2017 provide a reliable basis for ascertaining whether or not children's mental health declined during the pandemic. In other words, is it a sufficiently robust comparison?
Yes, I would say so, yes.
I'm grateful. And in terms of the conditions that were most prevalent in 2017, I think it's correct. It was anxiety the disorder that was most common in children at that point.
Yes, so the most single type of disorder that was most common in 2017 was types of anxiety disorder, yes.
And in terms of, you also make the point then, I think, that disorders also increase with age as well in your report. And I just wanted to clarify, does that mean that if you take a child with a mental disorder at 12, that their condition is likely to become more severe? Or is it that as a population, children just become more mentally unwell as they get older?
Yes, that's a good point. So it's more the second point than the first. So it is the case that as children move into adolescence, they become more likely to develop we're using disorder here as a condition, such as anxiety or depression. But it could also be that if a child has one of those conditions when they're younger, that may also worsen over time for them individually. But when we talk about mental health problems being more common in adolescents than in younger children, we mean that a 15 or 16-year-old is more likely to have a condition than a 6-year-old, particularly when it comes to these kind of anxiety and depression.
And just then turning for a moment, if I may, to Northern Ireland, in your report you make the point that there was survey work done between 2019 and 2020 in Northern Ireland, but it's not the same as the study that was done in 2017, and it was using a different measurement. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So there was a large sort of youth wellbeing study conducted in Northern Ireland, as you say, and it used a whole range of different quite well-validated measures of mental health, but not the same measures as in the English 2017 survey.
And I think because those results may have suggested that there was a greater prevalence in mental health conditions in children, or diagnoses, in Northern Ireland. And I think that in your report you maybe suggest that that needs to be treated with caution.
Yes, I think it's because the measures that we used in the Northern Ireland survey are, not strictly speaking, diagnostic measures, but they indicate children that might have a higher likelihood or probability of meeting criteria for a diagnosis or having very significant difficulties. So they can tell us a lot about the levels of difficulty, but it's not quite the same as saying that they would meet criteria for a diagnosis, which is what we could say in the 2017 survey from England.
All right. So stepping back from all of that and just looking at some of the things that may have been important during the pandemic, you say in your report that there is a key difference between adults and children when it comes to the development of mental illness, and that the critical point is that children are going through sensitive stages of development. Is that correct?
Yes.
Could you help the inquiry to just understand a bit more about that and why development should be, why that concept of development is so important when it comes to children developing specific conditions?
Yes. So I think, briefly speaking, when we think about children and young people, they are constantly developing, socially, emotionally, psychologically. The architecture of the brain is changing, and what they're going through periods which are, I suppose, sensitive. So influences on their environment at that time may have a greater impact on them than they would do on an adult, for instance. And it's also the case that a period of a few months or 6 months, for example, may be very significant to a child's development, whereas in an adult's life, that is perhaps to us more of a blink of an eye in time, if that makes sense.
And Dr. Nuala Delgado, can I ask you, this concern or this difference in children, that it's because they're going through stages of development that means that they're different to adults, are there specific ages within that period or during a whole child's development that are particularly important?
Yes. Perhaps if I can also just say, before I answer that it is the issue of development and time-sensitive experiences, one of the difference between adults and children, and why development is so important. But it's also not the only difference, I suppose, in that children's roles in society are different, psychologically and socially their environments are different, and also the way in which their problems might present are different. So there's quite a range of differences as well as the issue of development. But just to answer Sorry, I've now, having answered a different question, lost the thread. Do you mind reminding me?
I've probably lost the thread as well. Yes, I was asking you whether or not, if the inquiry approaches childhood on the basis that the entirety of childhood is a period of important development, whether within that band there are specific age groups, for example, or specific periods of development that are more sensitive than others.
Thank you for reminding me. I got sidetracked. So yes. So broadly speaking, given what we know about child development, we know that the very early years, the first 1,000 days, a period of 0 to 5, are, whilst all of childhood and adolescence is sensitive and important, those periods are probably particularly important because of the very rapid development that's going on and the different influences at that time. I would also say that sort of older adolescence and transition to adulthood is a sensitive period in slightly different ways, but because of the multiple transitions and the becoming more independent that are going on at that point. And it's also a very sort of peak time for the emergence of new mental health problems. And I think when we think also perhaps more about a child's wider environment, transition points are always sensitive for children and young people. So being able to kind of make a safe transition from primary to secondary school and land kind of safely there so they can make good progress. And beginning primary school is another one. So transitions can also be sensitive periods.
So forgive me, when I asked you the initial question about this, I focused on development as being an important distinguishing factor, and you've said, well, there's a lot more. Are there other particular points that you would draw out as being important in distinguishing adults and children in terms of mental health?
Yeah, so I think there's something about differences in the way that problems might present. So they might be harder to notice in children. So, for instance, anxiety and depression in younger children might present itself with, children complaining of tummy aches or having quite physical symptoms, which they're harder to pick up. And that really does mean that you need the right expertise in people dealing with children and young people. So that's one difference. I think that's quite important to emphasise. And I think there is also something about the influence that the immediate family have on younger children that's somewhat different to adults, because as adults, obviously our families, our close relationships are important to us and influence our health, but they're so critical for younger children. And perhaps related to that, and I hope I'm not straying from the point, but I think the other issue is to do with children's autonomy or lack of it. And I think this is pertinent to the pandemic because children generally will have less control over their lives, less ability to escape a situation or change a situation, particularly at home, than adults will do. And that, again, can be another impact on or difference when we're thinking about their mental health.
And is that particularly important, perhaps, when it comes to teenagers who might be a point where they want to, if in ordinary times, want to challenge barriers or assert themselves away from their families a bit more? I think we can touch on this very briefly. One of the points when it comes to the the systems that supported children's mental health across the different parts of the UK, I think it's your opinion that in broad terms, the systems in each part of the UK were equally under pressure prior to the pandemic. Is that correct?
I think probably in broad terms, I would probably refer to some of the other witness statements for the details of some of the services and the differences that there might be between the systems. But I think generally evidence from all of the 4 nations suggests that services were under pressure with increases in referrals and waiting lists before the pandemic.
All right, we'll turn then to the pandemic and some of the things that you've set out in your opinion. But if I can take your overarching starting point, you've incorporated into your opinion the observation that the pandemic was a systemic shock to children's mental health. Can you just explain what you mean by a systemic shock?
Yes, so that is, I think, is a quote from another researcher, but it's one to which I think is a useful phrase. So when I refer to it as a systemic shock, I think we would mean that almost all of the systems around the child, and a child is part of a system, you know, the family, the community, the school, etc., experienced a shock or a change or a disruption. And so given everything that we know about the determinants of children's mental health and well-being, that these, for many children, were sort of being systematically disrupted in some way.
And just turning to one of those, as it were, system shocks, that most children were not attending school. In your opinion, to what extent was that of itself a significant or large shock, as it were, capable of impacting children's mental health?
Yes, I think as in the way that you've set the question up, it's true that it is quite difficult to disentangle it from all the other things that were happening at the same time, because this wasn't set up as a sort of perfect experiment to test that. But when we think about the role that schools have for children and young people, and the fact that they are there for however many hours a day, for 5 days a week for this period of time, they are very central places. So I think in terms of all the different roles that schools play beyond education, I think it's fair to say that the closure or partial closure, or however you want to term it, of schools for in-person learning would have been a substantial part of that shock.
And can you also assist in terms of understanding the potential of the pandemic to impact across all children in society, having regard to those sorts of systematic shocks that you have pointed to in your evidence? I hope that makes sense.
Sorry, would you mind just rephrasing the start of that?
When I finished, I realised it hadn't been clear.
Thank you.
To what extent was the pandemic and the systemic shocks that you consider in your report capable of impacting the mental health of all children across the board?
Yes. So in answer, I think it was capable of reaching all children. I find it hard to think of a group of children and young people that wouldn't have been impacted in some way. But as we'll no doubt draw out, it wasn't a uniform impact, of course. But to a greater or lesser extent, I think all children and young people would have been impacted.
And is that because some children would have been in a situation whereby there were more compensations, perhaps for school closures, as compared to other children?
Yeah, so I think if we think of it in terms of risk and protective factors, that some children would be in a situation whereby maybe that first of all they had fewer existing vulnerabilities, but also they had more protective factors around them. So that might be a financially secure household, or a household where everybody was in good health, or where parents were able to, you know, give that particular care and attention to the child in those circumstances. Or, you know, access to the resources they needed, or creative approaches to play, or access to green space. I mean, I could go on, but
Yes.
you can see that there are some families would have access or be able to provide those protective factors and buffers for their child, whereas for other families that would be much more difficult.
All right, and just turning them, we can perhaps consider that in a bit more detail, but just turning to the principal findings that you came to, having regard to the studies that were carried out then throughout the pandemic. May I check one thing, please? The study that was carried out in 2017 and then the repeat of that study during the pandemic, did that follow the same children from 2017 onwards, or was it looking at different children over time?
It was the same children, so the children that were included in 2017 were followed up in 2020.
And is that what gives you the ability then to say these rates of probable mental disorder increased because you're looking at the same child and
Not
deterioration?
quite. What it enables us to do is to compare cross-sectionally, so by which I mean that we can look at what was the rate of probable disorder amongst children aged 5 to 16, for example, in 2017, and then we can look at the sample in 2020 at the children in that same age bracket then and say the rates of disorder were higher. So we are comparing, we're able to compare the same age groups in 2020 and 2017. And that's really important because, if you might remember, I referred to the fact that as children grow older, they are more likely to develop a mental health condition. So it means that it's a better comparison.
So can we just pick up then, I think this is really the crux of your evidence, what you found about what happened to the prevalence of possible mental health conditions then during the pandemic period?
Yes, so the evidence from the England Mental Health of Children and Young People survey showed a increase from around 1 in 9 children with a probable disorder in 2017 to 1 in 6 in 2020, which is a very sharp jump, particularly given what we had previously seen in terms of pre-pandemic trends, which suggested a very slight increase over time. So we saw that a very slight increase prior to the pandemic, and then between 2017 and 2020, this very sharp increase.
And just in terms of what happened then during the pandemic, and what happened to rates of possible mental disorder during the pandemic, can you just explain that?
Yes, so thinking about, again, that same survey series, we followed up those children in 2020, 2021, 2022 and 2023. And what we found is after that sharp rise between 2017 and 2020, that rates of probable disorder remained at that elevated level. So we did not see a decrease in problems. There was no evidence that things were improving after that initial deterioration. And in fact, for 17 to 19-year-old age group, we saw a further rise in the prevalence of probable disorder between 2021 and 2022.
So I think what you've said in your statement was that in terms of those aged 17 to 19,
Yes.
There was an increase in prevalence from 1 in 6 in 2021 to 1 in 4.
Yes.
Between of those aged 17 to 19 in 2022, and we'll come back to possible reasons for that. But I wonder if we could just look at this is just a single graph, just to see the visual illustration of this, which is at page 26 of your report. And I think the first graph is prevalence of all children, so one can see the visual representation, but I just wanted to ask you about that leap between 2017 and 2020. To what extent are you able to explain that leap by reference to the pandemic as opposed to other factors?
Yes. So I think it's important to stress that we can't make a definite, we can't definitely infer that the pandemic caused that leap because the study isn't set up to allow us to do that. But when we look at the trends we saw before the pandemic, which were for a very gradual increase, if those trends were to have stayed the same between 2017 and 2020, we wouldn't have had such a sharp increase. And that is to say, probably a bit more concisely, that increase does not represent just a continuation of the pre-pandemic trend, that it seems to represent something different that has happened between 2017 and 2020. And whilst there are other factors that might explain some of this more gradual increases over time in mental health problems, and I think many people here will be familiar with some of the things that are discussed in terms of the digital environment or inequalities or school pressures, we wouldn't expect those things to have had such a dramatic increase as this had. And given what we know about the risk and protective factors for child mental health, then that leads us to conclude that I think the pandemic would have been really the substantial reason behind that sharp rise.
And if we just look, please, at the second part of this page, this enables the inquiry to see the difference, and this is specific to those aged between 17 and 19. So I think even more stark when you see it visually represented in this way.
Yeah.
And from your perspective, is it of particular concern that the graph in 2022 should look like that, as opposed to how it looked even in 2020 or 2021?
Yes, so I think it is concerning, and this was an unexpected finding when we first saw the findings to the 2022 survey. So just to be clear, what we're doing here is comparing those who are aged 17 to 19 in 2022 with those in the same age bracket in 2021, yes. 2020, etc. And I think if we are to look at why that might be, it is because these young people who were 17 to 19 in 2022 are those that would have been sort of 15 to 17 yes. around the time of the pandemic. And obviously we can expand on why, therefore, they might be particularly impacted.
I think that can come down. And if I can ask you about that, because that's a good point too. In your opinion, what is it that happened to those children during the pandemic that might account for this, recognising there may be other factors too, of course, but what is your opinion as to that?
Yes, I think our view would be that these young people were, as I say, those aged 15 to 17 at the time of when the pandemic started, would have been those that were going through one of those sort of quite critical transition points that we talked about earlier in the evidence. So they would be, beginning to sit potentially important exams, they might be moving from school to college, they might be thinking about apprenticeships, new relationships, all of those transitions that sort of older adolescents are going through, and sort of concentrated into that particular period of time. So many of their major milestones and life events for this group in particular were impacted.
And may I go back to something you said just a little while ago about how I think you were suggesting that having regard to everything that happened during the pandemic, it would be expected that there would be an impact on children's mental health. Is that correct?
Yes.
First of all, in terms of the general population of children, are these statistics related to possible mental health disorders? Do they accord with what your expectations would have been, having regard to the sorts of system shocks that you referred to?
So by that, do you mean that given the impact of the pandemic, would I expect those figures to be as they are?
It's probably a slightly different question.
Oh, right.
Given the sorts of shocks that you've referred to in your report, things like children not going to school and being at home, are these is this outcome, or are these statistics broadly in accordance with what you would have expected to happen to children's mental health?
I think it's a very hard question to answer, actually, because I do remember being very surprised by the findings of the survey in 2020, although I was part of the team that conducted it. So I don't know that I expected the impact to be quite of that scale or as sustained. But at the same time, I would certainly have expected some degree of very significant impact, and that is what we've seen. So I think on balance, yes.
And in terms of those children who were 15, 16, and the impact that's reflected, was that a greater impact than perhaps you would have anticipated on young people of that age?
I think, again, it's very hard to say, if you'll excuse me, not being able to come to a definite conclusion on it, because I know the word unprecedented has been used a lot in relation to this, but I think genuinely it was unprecedented. So it would be quite hard to know the scale of what we might expect. But I still think that these are the kinds of impacts that we would expect given what we know about the risk and protective factors.
And I think it's right to say as well that the most recent figures, because this brings us up to those graphs brought us to 2023, have the figures stayed broadly the same?
Yes, they have. Yes. So the last sweep of those follow-up surveys in England was in 2023, and there was no improvement. It was broadly the same as it had been for the previous year.
And this is a very simple question, but given that the pandemic ended 5 years ago and children's lives hopefully would have returned to normality, is there an explanation as to why the figures remain elevated at that level and consistent with the pandemic period?
So I think firstly, to say, so those figures, or the most recent figures that we have from that survey, are from 2023, so it's only maybe from 18 months after the pandemic ended. So I think given what we know about the potential for impacts on children and young people's mental health at sensitive stages can be long-lasting. So, if children develop a mental health condition, and they have then therefore become more vulnerable as a result of that, we wouldn't necessarily expect that they would just bounce back to normal. So I think there's that to consider. And there may be a whole group of children and young people who perhaps pre-pandemic were maybe just about managing. They had some difficulties, but probably nothing that would be diagnosable or require high levels of support, but the pandemic may have been enough just to tip them over into that, and then those difficulties may have continued. And I think there are probably some other factors that have contributed to the ongoing high levels, because even before the pandemic, we were seeing this slight increase in particular in emotional difficulties. So it could be that other societal factors might have contributed to that staying at a high level. So there are potentially issues around, access to services, around inequalities, around digital environment, around school pressures, a whole range of kind of theories as to why we might be seeing continued high levels.
So does that mean that the pandemic may possibly have accelerated or exacerbated trends that were starting to emerge prior to it?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I think we are a little bit in the dark, though, because of that latest data being from 2023. And I think the other important thing to say would be, although I think those surveys probably give us the best snapshot from England, over time, the proportion of children and young people that were taking part in those surveys did decrease. So I think that we probably still need some new and better data to understand what's happening right now at this moment.
I just want to ask you then about some very specific disorders that increased during the pandemic. And I think that in your report you point in particular to there being a very marked increase in eating disorders. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And I think, in fact, if you need this, I think you have it at paragraph 19 and 53 as well, as if you need it. But you point to what the survey results say about that. And I think what you say there is that there is a rise from 6.7% in a possible eating disorder in 2017 to 13% in 2021 in 11 to 16-year-olds. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. That is possible eating problems rather than eating disorders.
All right, you might need to help me with the difference.
I'm happy to explain that.
And that also increased in 17 to 19-year-olds from 44.6% to 58.2%.
Yeah.
That obviously sounds very high, but is that explained by the fact that it's a possible eating problem rather than disorder?
Yes, I think it is, because the figures that we're talking about there come from sort of a set of screening questions which are designed to be sensitive, that is, to pick up any indication that a child might possibly have an eating disorder. And so what those figures refer to are the proportion of children that may have a possible problem with eating. Only a small proportion of those would be likely to have a clinically diagnosable eating disorder. And I can talk a little bit, because we also studied changes in eating disorders between 2017 and 2023, so I can talk to that if you would like. But just to say that regardless of the instrument, we still see a rise.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think it's a rise that's borne out by other evidence that you point to in your evidence as well. So, for example, the rise in hospital admissions for children who have an eating disorder as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think as well that we know this was included in your bundle, but I won't take you to it. We have evidence from a Professor Chitsabeeson that admissions to paediatric wards had increased, particularly due to eating disorders as well. So just coming back to the point, is that broadly consistent with the evidence that you were seeing in the survey results as well?
Yes, so both the results that you took me through about possible eating problems, but also the research that we did looking at specifically eating disorders, all indicate a rise in possible eating problems, but also eating disorders. And the evidence from services that's presented in the other reports also corroborates that in terms of presentations to services, crises, etc.
And again, does that give a clue as to what might have been causing some children distress during the pandemic to produce this sort of increase?
Yes, I think it does. I think it does suggest that there was a link between the pandemic and the rise in eating problems and disorders. And I can talk to a bit about why we think that might be.
Yes, please. What is your opinion as to why that might have happened?
Yes. So there's been sort of a range of papers from eating disorders experts that have discussed this. So myself, not a specific expert in eating disorders, but firstly, if we think about it, young people who might have a vulnerability to an eating disorder will use certain coping strategies or daily routines, really, to try and keep themselves well. And when you think about the huge change in young people's lives that the pandemic brought, it's natural that that would have disrupted their coping and their daily routine. Also, if you think about the sense of uncertainty yes, just a loss of control that many of us felt. Young people may have turned to controlling their eating or exercise habits or whatever as an attempt to exert control, and that may therefore have led into, I suppose, colloquially speaking, a bit of a spiral of disordered eating. In terms of eating disorders, we also know that if children are going to be in quite a high pressure environment of the home in the context of the pandemic, they lose a lot of privacy. They may be eating, with family, whereas previously they've eaten in all kinds of different places. Again, that might affect or increase eating disorders. And then there's the influence of spending potentially more time online or in virtual environments where children may be exposed to harmful material for example, around sort of pro-anorexia websites, or even just more content around body image. And I think some of the concerns around obesity and COVID-19 might also have prompted children to be more concerned about maintaining a healthy weight. And then there's obviously the access to support and services which would have been disrupted. So I think those are probably the key reasons.
And in terms of exposure to what's on the internet, is the concern there that because children were at home and online, they were consuming potentially more harmful content, or is it a different problem?
I think that is probably the crux of the problem, because they would have been spending more time online. They would also be seeking out connection more online because of the lack of in-person connection. And whilst virtual connection can be really helpful, and in fact it sounds from the testimony of many children that it was helpful for them, but the fact that they were spending more time looking for those connections might also mean they were more drawn into those online communities, as well as spending more time online. And of course it would be very difficult for them to be supervised at all times doing that, given the pressure on parents and families and so on.
All right. I'm going to move on then, if I may, to deal with some of the differential impacts of the pandemic on children. And I wanted to start with children, younger children, who you've already mentioned. Did the pandemic, you've said that it may have presented particular challenges to them. Is there evidence that their mental health declined during the pandemic as well?
Yeah, so I think in general, when we look at the different age groups and the various studies that are out there, there are some studies which suggest that the younger age groups were possibly slightly more impacted than, say, children of secondary school age, for example. I think it is, however, fair to say that there were probably fewer studies done of very young children, although my colleague, Professor Creswell, who co-authored this report by me, had done some work with that group. But yes, I think there was some evidence to suggest they were more impacted.
I think you say in your report that you think it's a concerning gap that there isn't more known about children of that age. Is that a general concern, that there isn't sufficient research on younger children under 5, or is it that specifically related to the pandemic?
Possibly both, although I will say that recently there have been several, at least one or two that I'm aware of, new cohort studies that have been set up which will examine the health of babies and younger children. So I think that gap is being filled, actually. But when we look at the time of the pandemic, and in particular to one of the main sources of data, which is the Mental Health of Children and Young People surveys, the children in those surveys were 5 in 2020, which meant that we didn't have data on the sort of 2 to 4 year olds. So I think that was a bit of a gap at the time of the pandemic, in my view, one which is gradually being filled.
And then turning to socioeconomic disadvantage as a factor in children's vulnerability to developing mental health conditions. Can you explain, in relation to the pandemic, how that might have had an effect?
Yes, so I think the evidence on this is, there is some mixed evidence around here, but we can see that children living in more disadvantaged circumstances would necessarily have been probably exposed to more risk factors and probably had fewer protective factors to kind of bolster them or buffer them against the effect of the pandemic. And obviously those would include things like financial stresses, as well as perhaps living in less suitable accommodation, access to green space, and access to other resources.
And I think you do say, in relation to younger children as well, that the Bourne and Bradford study helped on children who were aged between 6 to 11 in terms of understanding the impact on them of socioeconomic disadvantage. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I think I refer to that in this section as well.
You do. It's at paragraph 70. You deal with it at 77 to 80, but I think in short, that children in the most deprived quintile were most likely to experience worsening of mental health difficulties. Is that right?
Yes.
But I think importantly for our purposes, that was in relation to this younger I mean, they're still aged 6 to 11, but nonetheless provide some sort of insight into impact on this younger group of young people as
Yes,
well. Is
it
that
does.
right? And then if I can turn to another group, and I think it's at paragraph 83 onwards, and just to try and understand a bit more about this, but that children with special educational needs may also have a particular vulnerability to developing a mental health condition as well. Is that correct?
Yes, so even putting aside the impact of the pandemic, we know that children with long-term health conditions and or those with special educational needs and disabilities are at higher risk of having mental health problems as it stands. And then during the pandemic, they certainly were a group that we were concerned about, partly because of disruptions to their support, but also perhaps because of the nature of some of their difficulties.
And was another concern in relation to that group that having unmet needs may be a contributor towards the development of a mental health condition as well?
Yes, so I think it's certainly possible that if those children's needs for therapy or support or whatever other needs they might have were not being met, that could have an impact on their levels of distress and their mental health, but also very much so on the families around them, which again would impact also the child.
And another specific group that you refer to in your report as well is children who had a parent who had a mental health condition as well, that might have made them more vulnerable. Is that a particular concern in the context of a national emergency or a pandemic situation?
I think it is always, it's always something that we are conscious of, in terms of thinking about the family as a whole, that where a parent may be struggling with their mental health, that may impact on the child, but also that children's mental health can impact on the parents too. So it's a complex relationship. But in the context of a pandemic, when the parent may be experiencing increased stresses themselves, which might make it more difficult for them to manage their own mental health, and the parent may be experiencing disruptions to their support system, then really there's, yes, that is a concerning impact on the family as a whole.
Yes, forgive me, I really meant it at a sort of population level,
Yes.
whether that is something that needs to be borne in mind.
Yes,
might be an
I
impact.
would say so. And I think it's relevant to note that I think some studies of adults suggested that parents of children or parents who had children living at home might be more likely to be experiencing mental health difficulties. So it's certainly something that's very relevant when we're thinking about a whole population.
And then another group who you discuss in your evidence as well is those children who lived in clinically vulnerable families as well. And I think that just looking at this from the context of the child within that situation, I think that you came to the opinion that those children were also likely to be experiencing distress or difficulty as well that might make them more vulnerable to developing a mental health condition. Is that right?
Yes, I think absolutely. They may already be more vulnerable to experiencing a mental health difficulty. And then when you add into that perhaps the additional distancing or isolation measures that might be needed, along with the concern and worry about their health, then that would be a group that we would be concerned about.
And equally, those children who have long COVID as well, I think that you also came to an opinion also about those children too. I think you've got that at paragraph 96 of your report if you need it.
Yes, thank you.
That they may also, because of the consequences of having a post-infection syndrome, also be susceptible or vulnerable as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. I mean, having a post-infection syndrome can affect a child's physical and mental health. And when they might be living day to day with symptoms of tiredness or fatigue or pain or whatever that might be, that can have a knock-on impact on their mental health. So yes, that's another group that would need appropriate support and monitoring.
The inquiry has heard some evidence about children who were being cared for during the pandemic and about their experiences. And one of the things that you set out in your report as well is about the particular prevalence of mental health conditions in those children as a population as well. Is that correct? And is it right that I think you say that it's 1 in 2 children?
Yes, I think that's correct. In terms of the studies that have been done of children in care, that they are more likely than children in the general population to experience a mental health problem. And yes, I think the figure that I present in there pre-pandemic, I think is 1 in 2. But
Yes.
you might need to direct me to the paragraph.
You've got it at paragraphs 99 to 101.
Thank you.
But I
Yes,
think what
that's
you go on to point to is that there were studies carried out during the pandemic as well that focused on those children and what they were experiencing also, and about feeling more lonely and anxious than they would normally feel. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So there are various sort of surveys that have been done with that group where children report feeling more isolated or feeling more anxious. And there's also qualitative studies as well of their experiences. I think it's fair to say that some do report more positive experiences of feeling well supported, but for others that wouldn't be the case.
I'm just going to deal with one final group and then come to some headline points about this. But another group of children who you consider in your report are those children who are detained in various forms of detention as well. So, for example, children who are detained in the Children and Youth Estate. And I think, first of all, the question as to whether, as a population, those children prior to the pandemic would have had a higher incidence of mental ill health or be more vulnerable to developing one.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, probably a point that I should have made earlier in relation to all of these groups, I think, is about the compounding of disadvantage and risk. So usually it's possible that a child who belongs to one of these groups may also belong to other risk groups, or they may have sort of intersectional inequalities, as in they may be from a minoritised ethnic group and also have a certain sexuality, or also be living in economic disadvantage, and all of these risk factors can compound themselves. And so when we think particularly about young people in the custody of the state, that they may have backgrounds where they perhaps more likely to have been exposed to trauma or abuse or other factors, so they would already be a higher risk group.
And just having regard to that and the fact we've heard evidence that some of these children were being kept in their cells for over 20 hours a day and perhaps up to 23 hours a day. Can you assist or provide your opinion as to the sort of impact that might have on children with that background or vulnerability?
I mean, yes, I think I would say that could potentially have a very severe impact because the children already potentially have experienced traumatising experiences previously. They would be vulnerable, and so being exposed to that type of isolation, when they're already vulnerable, could have quite a severe impact on them potentially. Yes.
And I think we've seen some evidence as well about children. I don't need to take you to it. It was in your bundle that children who were also in residential mental health care during the pandemic as well, that some of those children weren't able to have access to their families. Is that correct? In other words, they weren't allowed, that's probably putting it too widely, they weren't allowed to have in-person visits. Is that right?
Yes, I think that's my understanding from the witness report, that in some cases that due to infection prevention and control measures, that seemed to be the case.
And is it a surprise to you, as someone expert in this field, that children who are in hospital because of mental health disorders should be unable to see their family whilst they were there during a pandemic? Or
So I certainly think it's concerning, given the impact that might have on them and the fact that they're vulnerable. I do acknowledge, of course, that there were infection control guidance in place and procedures, and that people were doing their best to work with those. And I think that's laid out quite well in some of the other witness statements. So it was a complex situation, but certainly not being able to see their family in person would have contributed very likely to increase feelings of isolation and potentially detrimental impacts.
So just coming back then, you've considered in the course of your evidence different groups of children within society who might be particularly vulnerable to developing mental health conditions. I mean, in your opinion, does that mean for the purposes of pandemic planning or responding to a pandemic that very specific consideration needs to be given to the fact that there will be these children who require perhaps additional levels of protection or additional levels of intervention?
Yes, I think absolutely so, and that those groups would need to be very explicitly considered in planning and mitigation. And I think probably another point is that I think it's probably not a completely exhaustive list of children that might be differentially impacted. And so that is why listening to the voices of children, young people and families and organisations that representing them is key, because they may be aware of other groups. I think we probably covered the main ones in this report, but there may well be others.
And have you come to any conclusions in the course of all of your work, not just in preparing your report for this inquiry, as to any really practical things that you think could have been done better during the pandemic period to help some of these specific groups of children, or perhaps children more broadly?
Yes, so I think it's a very good question. I think one thing that we've discussed doing is an approach that would be, I suppose, more flexible and creative in enabling opportunities for connection for children and young people. So we've heard a lot about the different restrictions on in-person gathering, and obviously the balance of risk is really important here. But it does seem that there may have been opportunities to enable more in-person contact for younger children, for example, opportunities for outdoor play and connection that might have been able to have been done relatively safely, obviously balancing up risk, and or creatively. So there were lots of professionals in creative industries, for example, who might have been on furlough or out of work, who might have been able to work with children. There would have been outdoor spaces and places where they could potentially play, where the risk may have been lower. So I think just putting things in place or an approach that is maybe more enabling and facilitating of those things would have been helpful. I think there are probably others as well, which we can talk through.
So the key thing I think you're saying is it's for children, it's being able to see other children. Is that the key thing?
I think so. I think being able to connect with peers, with other children, to be able to play and to be outdoors as well. And to have that sense of sort of support and structure and routine as well. So obviously thinking about how school closures might be able to be done differently or more flexibly or more partially is obviously another thing that's related to that.
And in terms of any of the other really practical things, you said a moment ago that you had other ideas as well as to what could be done. What are the other main things that you think might possibly make a difference?
Yes, so I think one of the others that we mention in the report is around support for families and how, particularly for families with younger children, I make reference in there to the Scottish model of sort of closed childcare clusters, which would enable families with younger children to sort of bubble together, if you like, which enables support for the parents in terms of childcare and sort of parent-to-parent support, but also for those children to be able to play together relatively freely. And there's sort of a whole paper that's been written about it in the way that there are different options which you could do it, which would have different risks of infection depending on the one that you chose, but maybe offering families more of a or co-producing a kind of menu of these are some of the ways in which you could maintain contact depending on obviously the risks of whether you're in contact with elderly grandparents or you have other people at risk in your family. So something like that I think would be practically helpful.
But again, in terms of extrapolating that to a broader principle or idea, it's about finding ways of enabling families to have some sort of support, children to have more contact with other children, balanced against the risk of transmission.
Yes, I
So-
think that's what it boils down to. And hopefully with the benefit of learning from this pandemic that we might be able to put forward some ways in which that might work. Obviously, we don't know what form a future pandemic might take or who the risk groups might be in
Yes.
such a situation. So obviously that might change. And I think also just to mention young people as well. So I've talked there quite a lot about families with young children, but there may be sort of older adolescents or young people who are living on their own, for example, care leavers, or young people just starting a family themselves, or the 18-year-old that might be living on their own. So I think we would also need options to support that group of young people too. But in short, it would be about just some more creative and flexible enabling of some degree of connection that's balanced with risk.
And turning then to the sorts of support that was available to children during the pandemic, you've set that out in quite a lot of detail in your report. I just wanted to ask you about the use of remote forms of contact for children to help them with their mental health. So, for example, being able to speak to a counsellor or a psychologist online. Can you just explain a bit about your understanding as to what children thought about that sort of provision?
Yes, so I think it's fair to say that some children or young people did find it beneficial to be able to talk to somebody online. They might have liked the flexibility. In some cases, they may have found it a bit less intimidating or more easy to be able to speak freely to a screen than in a room with somebody. So for some children there are advantages, but for a number, when we listened to them talk about their experience, they didn't find that it suited them so well. So they may not like seeing themselves on camera. They may find it more difficult to strike up a rapport with the therapist or the counsellor. And some may also find that it's more difficult to engage in a kind of more creative therapies in that environment. And then for those that might have communication difficulties or those with special educational needs and disabilities, that online environment might be difficult. I'm thinking also privacy as well is a really important consideration for young people. And there is evidence that some of them felt uncomfortable potentially having counselling or online sessions because they could be overheard by other members of the family. And of course, in more extreme cases, there are potentially risks there around safeguarding if a young person is not in a safe environment at home.
And I think in terms just of your overall conclusions about the extent to which provision during the pandemic was able to meet the needs of children who were developing or who had mental health conditions, can you just explain what your overall view is? So in other words, the adequacy of services during the pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to say that there was some real efforts being made to meet those needs, and that staff in services and those organising services were able to move quite rapidly in terms of putting together an online service or pivoting services to meet those needs. There was a lot of funding that went to organisations to provide online counselling and therapy and training for teachers. So there was a lot of support that was put in place. But I think given the nature of the impact, that I still think that to some degree fell short of the need because the level of need was such. And I think I'd also say that quite a few of the efforts that I've described are less preventative and are more about mitigating an impact that's already there. So thinking about things like online counselling, that is more about attempting to meet a need that has emerged, but it's not necessarily preventative. And so some of the things that we've talked about in terms of, enabling connection, also things like financial support, those things would be more about preventing problems from emerging or getting worse. So I think whilst there are some really good efforts being made, particularly as the pandemic progressed and we learned more, I think an improvement would be if those were pivoted both to prevention as well as to intervention.
You say at paragraph 119, given what is known about the key influences on children and young people's mental health and well-being, the impact of COVID-19 and the pandemic restrictions could arguably have been foreseen and preventative measures undertaken at an earlier stage. Are you able to identify any preventative measures that you think could have been put in place a bit earlier on?
Yes, so I think some of those measures might be ones that we have talked about. So they might be things like enabling more mixing for younger children in a safe environment. They might have been more of a menu of options for families. They might have been around enabling some connections for older children, or thinking about different models of school attendance, for example. So I think those are all, and I think arguably the school attendance one is tricky. I think they are all tricky, but I think a lot of the mitigation measures that were put in place were more thinking about children are presenting or they're having more mental health problems. How do we address those? And we also should have been thinking about how do we prevent those from arising in the first place.
Do you think that families knew enough about the potential risks to children's mental health from the pandemic? In other words, could more be done to help families to support children?
Yes, and I think, thank you for raising that, because I think that is another point in the recommendation, is that one of the things we highlight is if we're able to give families and parents the tools, then they are able to better support their children, and there's good evidence that that works. That does have to be balanced, of course, with putting additional demands on families or making them feel as though they are fully responsible for providing a therapy or support for their child's mental health. But I think, yes, giving parents the tools and the information so that they can support is important. But I think at the same time, we probably also need to be careful in a pandemic situation not to add anxiety to parents as well. So I think it's about clear messaging and provision of careful information. And that, I think, also brings me to a point I forgot to mention earlier, is about communication with children and young people themselves as well, and the messages that they were receiving. So I think also making sure that they were well informed would also be important.
And is that a concern again? I mean, does that also relate to the sorts of things that maybe children were picking up online as well? Or are you talking about different types of messaging?
Yeah, so I think it probably relates to all different kinds. They would both be the kind of messaging that they might be exposed to online, but also public messaging around the pandemic would, I think, probably unavoidably be anxiety-provoking to children. But there may have been some ways in which better communications tailored towards children and young people could have been made.
And finally, I just wanted to come to provision as it stands at the moment, and whether or not you're able to say whether or not the provision of mental health services at this time have they caught up with the level of demand that now exists?
I think there have been improvements made. If we look at the data, it looks as though more children are being seen, and in some areas more targets are beginning to be met. But at the same time, we still experience more children. There are still significant numbers of children on waiting lists, and there's a lot of variation as well from what we hear around the country. So there is still some way, there are efforts being made and there is some progress being made, but given the scale and the nature of the problem, there is much further still to go.
And then just drawing back overall into your overall conclusions that you've set out at the end of your report, I won't go through all of them, but is a key conclusion that you've reached that there is a real need on the part of policymakers to understand more about children's development and its interlinked, I can hardly say it, how interlinked it is to their mental health as well?
Yes, I think that would be fair to say. I think there are a lot of really good efforts being made by a number of organisations to make the case for children and young people. And I think that was the case during the pandemic as well. But I think there is obviously further to go in terms of recognising the importance of children and young people as a group, the importance of prevention and, I suppose, proportionate investment in them, particularly given that they do seem to be a group that has really experienced these very significant impacts.
And I think one of the things that you say as well is that there's a need for ongoing research to understand, in particular, the young people who were children during the time of the pandemic as well, and to carry on tracing, as it were, any trends or developments in relation to them. Is that right?
Yes. Yes, so we've recommended that continuing to follow up these children, if possible, would be really important. And I think also being sort of ready, or having research in a state of readiness so that we could mobilise quickly again if needed in the case of another pandemic. So in the case of the National Child Mental Health Surveys in England, we were quite fortunate in that there was this large survey done in 2017, and actually a lot of the infrastructure and expertise was there ready to move into the field in 2020. But without that existing cohort in place, we wouldn't necessarily have been able to do that. And I think that's also relevant, thinking about the importance of evaluating measures that were taken and how helpful or unhelpful they were, is that we also need research which can evaluate mitigation measures or interventions. So, for example, you mentioned remote consultations for children and young people. So having research that's able to quickly evaluate those and say what's working, what's not working, that's also really important. And again, having that research infrastructure in place. And if you will excuse me making another point, I think that the involvement of children and young people in the design of that research and the research questions that we're asking, obviously throughout the report and everything we've said, their voices should be central, but the same goes for research, because they may have, and I often find this the case in children and young people's research, is that they come up with something that I hadn't thought of. So it's really important that we involve them in the whole process.
Thank you. I'm grateful. Dr. Newlove Delgado, those are all my questions.
Thank you.
Wendy,
I've got
did
one
you-
question before Iqbal asks her question. You talked about, as opposed to closing schools, and I am using that word because they were, as far as most people were concerned, closed. Apart from closing schools to virtually everybody, apart from the one or two who attended, you talked about adapting school. Did by that you mean things like considering staggered attendance, the use of what I'm going to call Nightingale schools, for want of a better word? Is that the kind of thing you had in mind?
Yes, I think so. I think because schools are so central, and schools and childcare settings are so central to the lives of children and young people, that I think being able to be as creative and adaptable as we can be to attempt to replicate some of the functions that schools provide, even if it doesn't look like the traditional school day when children are in from 8:30 till 3. So I think something along the lines of, there could be staggered days. I think Japan had a model where different children were in different days, Nightingale schools, or just attempts to replicate some of those functions that schools have. Because just to make one other point about the role of schools that I think we've heard about, is that particularly for disadvantaged children, they can play such an important role in terms of routine, structure, trusted adults, even school meals, that which are not replicated by virtual online education. So the more that we could do to have a menu of options to replicate some of those functions, if we can't run traditional schooling, I think that would be really important.
Thank you. Iqbal. She's that way.
Dr. Newlove Delgado, I'm asking a few questions on behalf of a grassroots organisation, Clinically Vulnerable Families. Looking at the section of your statement entitled Children and Young People Who Were Clinically Extremely Vulnerable or in Clinically Vulnerable Families, you've said at paragraph 89, that's page 40 if you want to turn that up,
Thank you.
that findings from adult studies of clinically extremely vulnerable individuals may not be applicable to children, and you've cited some of those studies and their findings. What research or data collection do you propose is needed to address this gap? and gather the needed data to provide robust evidence on the experiences of clinically vulnerable and clinically extremely vulnerable children during the pandemic?
Yes. So just to clarify, would you be asking me about what research is needed now or what research we would have needed to do?
We'd be asking what research is needed now.
Yes.
Better to prepare us for the next pandemic.
Yes, absolutely. So I would imagine that the experiences of those children who are clinically extremely vulnerable is probably still fresh in the minds of those children and families. And so I think there would be opportunities now if that hasn't been done. I'm not familiar with all the current research in the area, that there would be opportunities to hold interviews or focus groups or data gathering exercises now with them to learn lessons and to hear their voice. So I think that would be important. And I think it would be important to get their recommendations and thoughts about how, if there were to be another pandemic, how we could support them better, but also how we would know who they are, so that if we did have another pandemic and we needed to do rapid research with them to find out about what the issues were, that we could spring into action quite quickly. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Thank
Dr.
you.
And one further question. You already spoke about recommendations to help children's mental health generally in the event of a future pandemic via measures such as more contact with other children, playing outside. You noted that would have to be balanced against the risks of transmission. So do you propose any specific recommendations to improve the mental health outcomes of clinically vulnerable or clinically extremely vulnerable children and young people, bearing in mind their greater susceptibility to the risk of transmission and the accompanying anxiety of said risks?
Yes, thank you. That's a really good point, in that the recommendations that are made about enabling connection and potentially in-person connection would need to be tailored or adapted, or certainly seen in the light of individual risk to certain groups of children. And so, again, actually, I think that is something where, if we were to do research or simply to engage with organisations that are supporting those children, we could understand more about how those things could be tailored or adapted. So are there ways in which we could better adapt those things to be virtual or to be more distanced, or again to have some options for them so that they would not be further disadvantaged in those circumstances.
Thank you, Dr. Newliff.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
It's been an extremely interesting and very helpful afternoon. Doctor, I'm extremely grateful to you. And would you pass my thanks over to your colleague, Professor Cresswell, as well? Obviously, I'll bear in mind all that you've said in your report, but I think you've given a very interesting summary of your findings and conclusions. So thank you for your help.
Oh, thank you, my lady.
Very well, I think that completes the evidence for today.
There's just one thing, it's not evidence though. I've been asked to, my lady, just set out that obviously this concludes the oral evidence for week one of this module, and with your permission we'll adduce into evidence a number of witness statements from charities, non-governmental organisations, and from Dr. Alex George in his capacity as a former youth mental health ambassador. And yes, you have those on screen, my lady. They set out in detail more about the impact of the pandemic on a range of children and young people across the UK. And those organisations and individuals set that out, and they also set out work that was done to limit and mitigate those effects. And I understand those statements will be shortly on the inquiry's website, and that other key documents will be adduced and put on the website as well as we progress through the hearing.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, the default setting will be that obviously everything that we're going to use should be published. So thank you very much indeed. Very well, I shall return for the second week of evidence. Actually, I shan't return in the sense that I won't be here in person. Next week, I shall be conducting the hearings remotely, and we start at 10:30 on the Monday, the 6th of October. Thank you all very much.
All rise.